So would you all welcome Chief Gregory Mullen? Chief Mullen is in his second day of retirement. And I didn't bring up all of his entire bio, but he was made chief of police in Charleston in 2006. Before that, he had a 22-year career, both reserves and active duty in the Air Force. During his time in Charleston, he not only did some strategic changing, but a lot of, as we witnessed, some cultural changes in there, and we'll get into talking about that. He has his wife, Kendra, here with him, and they have a son who's in the Coast Guard.
That's right.
So you and I are just going to have a conversation. These people are just going to be voyeurs. I remember when that happened, that my first thought was horror. My first feeling was pain, and my first action was to just sit down and cry. What was your first thought, feeling, action when you found out?
Well, the first time that I was notified about the shooting was about 9/28, and my deputy chief called me and told me that we had had a shooting in a downtown church. And my first reaction was shock, because I just initially couldn't believe that had happened. And then very quickly thereafter, a second call came that said there was nine victims and that had died in the church. So after the shock wore off for just a few seconds, I knew that at that point I was at a defining moment of my career, and that my community would be looking to me to lead them, as well as my department, through what was coming next. And I had asked myself sometime back in 2006 when I took the job, and in 2007 we really started to go through some cultural change, and I realized that there was three defining questions that I had to continually ask myself, because we were talking about a cultural change, and it was, were the things that we were doing as an organization making a difference in the community? Was it resonating with the officers and staff internally? And was it worth the effort and the energy that it was going to take to make that change? So 10 years before this incident ever happened, those were the questions that were the filter for me as I went through a change process within the organization. And we went about change in many different ways, but predominantly we created a culture and a philosophy that we were there to provide a service to the community. And the only way we were going to be able to do that was to create relationships that were based on trust and legitimacy. And everything that we did had to be based on those factors. So regardless of whether it was working with the youth in a camp setting that we started, or reaching out in reentry programs that we worked through, or looking at the community to bring them in to help us design policies and implement programs, everything that we did was based on creating those relationships of trust and legitimacy. And so as we evolved over those years, and it became a way of operation, we began to role model that for not only our senior staff, which is very important and which was a key role as we move forward, also with the younger officers that were coming in. I mean, they started out in their pre-academy work with community service projects. They started out in our camp, so they were dealing with the kids, with the community. So over time, that belief that this is our community, this is our home, this is not a job or an obligation, this is our home, began to develop. And as we went through that evolution, we faced many tragedies, but none like this. And certainly when this night happened, it was a it was the moment that I could look back and see whether all of that work was really going to pay off, and it did. It did without question.
So if I were a movie director, if I were Clint Eastwood or Steven Spielberg or Ava DuVernay and I were going to shoot this, it would, the opening scene would be the church and the shooting, and then a call coming into you, and then the screen would go black, and then it would say 2 years earlier. So if we went back to the 2 years building up to that, and you weren't there yet. So when you walk into that job, what was the gap between where you wanted to end up and where you were starting? Was it a little bit of work, a lot of work, impossible work?
Well, it was a lot of work, and really it goes back to 2007. I went to Charleston in 2006, and in 2007 we really started developing that cultural change that would take us to the point of June 17th, 2015. And throughout those years, we were constantly working with our community. We were working with the youth within the neighborhoods. We were working with the elderly that we could go out and actually help them to understand what it was that we were doing. When we went out into a neighborhood to do any type of an enforcement action, we started to make sure that we went back and talked to people and explained to them what we were going to be doing and why we were going to be doing it, so that there was not that rumor and the innuendo about why we were there. And we actually went out and we built relationships with them through the fact that we would bring them into the police department, and we would start to have them be involved in things such as I said earlier, when we implemented a camera system within the city, we had a community group that came in and actually helped us write the policy for that. We went to the ACLU and asked them for input into that policy. So we were building those relationships along the way. And what we were doing as well is not focusing exclusively on law enforcement. We were looking at the things that were happening in our community that could work to the advantage of the city and its citizens, to where the law enforcement component never had to come into play. I was very specific with my officers, is that if we went out every day and we never arrested a single person, and there was no crime in the neighborhoods and people felt safe and they could enjoy their lives, then we were the biggest success in town. So it was not about arresting our way out of a problem. It was not about creating more beds in jails. It was about what we could do as an agency that really is the most visible agency of government, to bring together and connect different organizations so that we could have the best impact possible. An example of that is some years ago, we recognized that one of the biggest challenges that we were having in our city was children who were being exposed to violence in their neighborhoods on a regular basis. And what we found through our research was that if we didn't intervene in that very quickly, that could become normalized as behavior going into the future. So we reached out to our partners in mental health and started to look at how we could create a family violence unit that would bring together advocates, mental health clinicians, DSS workers, and bring them together as a team so that we could immediately respond to those young people that were going through those traumatic events that were really being lost. And as we did that, we started to see that in the first 3 years, we touched 1,500 children that would have never been receiving any type of intervention or any type of counseling. They would have simply been seeing violence on a regular basis and understanding that as a part of their community. And we kept doing those types of things and bringing people together, and throughout those 8-9 years, those relationships that were built all came together on that one night. Not only community relationships, partnerships that stretched law enforcement, mental health, victim advocacy, the medical facilities, chaplains, the faith-based communities, all of those things converged on that night. And what resulted from that was that we were able to manage a situation in a way that was a community tragedy. It was not a police problem. It was not a police issue. It was a community issue. And we'll go into probably more specific details, but that's really what had been happening over a period of time, and had really kind of gotten more specific in the last 2 years, because in 2014, in my opinion, law enforcement really changed because of all the events that were going on around the country. And while there had been evolutions in law enforcement going back decades, in those 2 years, everything changed. In my mind, law enforcement reset. We started looking at things much differently. We recognized that we had to change the way we were doing business, and a big part of what we were going to have to do to be successful was not just look at people's problems and say, we know the answer to your problem, and here's how we're going to fix it. It had to be, we have an issue, and we have to learn how to manage that issue, because not everything is a problem to solve. There's many things that are just issues that have to be managed because they deal with polarities.
And we'll come back to the shooting and the aftermath. But you talked about one of the partners you reached out to was the mental health for those young people. And one of our mantras at the foundation is that we're all in the health business. Everybody's in the health business. Law enforcement's in the health business. And I think law enforcement has a very particular and unique insight into the health of a community. And I've been asking police chiefs and sheriffs around this state what they see as the barriers to health in the communities they serve. And the issues they say are things like lack of a good education system is a barrier to a community being healthy. Lack of jobs. What are some of the things you saw as barriers to a community being healthy?
Well, one of the things that I have had the great opportunity, I think, to realize is that health is a much bigger component than what most people think about. When we talk about health, most people just think about doctors and health care, where in reality, if you look at the social determinants of health, there is many, many issues that come to play there, along with education and employment, violence and safety in your communities, whether or not you are able to go out and enjoy the spaces that you have. So from my perspective, what I have tried to do is look at public safety as a system. And within that system, there are all of those social determinants. And from what I have experienced is that the police department is really a portal that many of those different organizations can come into, and really we can leverage our resources to do great things, like education. I mean, we do a lot of things with our schools in terms of not just looking at the individual student in the classroom during the school year, but what is it that we can do during the summer to help those kids to stay on track. So we took our officers that work in the schools during the school year, and we have 5 campsites now that we bring them together, and we utilize curriculums out of the school to try to keep them on track as they go through. Now, some people would say that has absolutely nothing to do with law enforcement. I would say it has everything to do with law enforcement, because what I'm trying to do is make sure that that kid does not end up in the criminal justice system. And if I can take a few officers during the summer, hire a few college interns, bring together a group of volunteers from all over the system and all over the community, and help that child not only stay up to speed on what they need to do to learn, but also give them hope. Because one of the things that I have really seen, and it really started to drive me early in my career in Charleston, was that I would walk through some of the most challenged neighborhoods in the city, and I would look at young children, and what I would see is that they just had no hope. And I just felt that that was not acceptable. So we started to work really hard on children so that they would have hope, and by not only helping them with their education, exposing them to different types of environments, taking them to opportunities that they might not see normally. And we battled back and forth with people that said, that's really not going to make a difference. Well, I differ, because one of the kids, and this is just one example, one of the kids that came to our camp starting about 4 or 5 years ago, he told his mother when he came to the camp, he said, I don't want to go to cop camp. I don't want to go. Well, his mother said, well, you're going to cop camp. So he came. He is now a college intern working in our camps. And he told me last week that he's going to put in an application with the police department next June. So that tells me it does make a difference. Mm-hmm. And those are the types of things that we're doing, as well as reaching out to the medical profession to create a coalition. Another initiative that we're working on right now is to bring together our medical facilities, mental health, substance abuse, all of the nonprofits that are working in our area, along with the police, to create an opportunity for us to go into these challenged communities and not just talk to them about issues, but build relationships, help them to establish relationships with primary care providers, because one of the things that we found that part of the problem in these neighborhoods is that either I don't have a relationship with a primary care provider, or I'm not following the instructions that I'm getting from my medical providers, or I've just basically I'm not taking my meds, I'm not eating well. And all of those things come together to create an unhealthy community. Mm-hmm. And what I have been able to learn is that if I can bring all of those people together, and one of the things that has been very successful for me is that I've been able to bring groups of people together and make connections to where at the end of the day, we all see that we're working towards the same purpose. Mm-hmm. And by leveraging those things, and in some cases, starting out with, we don't say can't in this room. We're all talking about what we can do. And it's just been very successful. And, I think that we're making our communities healthier. And part of that system has now kind of created its own culture to where we're all working together and we're doing really good things for the community.
My daughter, when she's maybe about 12, she declared she wanted to marry a man just like her daddy. I was like, now wait a minute. He didn't come out of the box like that. I had to do some work on him to get him to where he is now. So you didn't come out of the box with the perspective that you now have.
Right.
What changed and what created the perspective you had? What was your journey? And
Well,
I know Kendra had a lot to do with it, what it was.
She really did. I started my policing career in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is a very affluent city, very low crime, not a lot of challenges per se. So I grew up in a world that taught me that police officers are supposed to be problem solvers. And that's what a lot of the people in this room have been taught over their careers as well, is that we're supposed to solve the problem. And that's what I had always understood, is that, I go out, I'm told what the problem is, I figure it out, and I go out and address it. When I went to Charleston, that was really my first exposure to what I would consider severe poverty, looking at individuals in communities that just appeared that they didn't have hope, and that, when I was walking down that street in the Charleston East Side that was in this movie, and the children in that neighborhood, when they saw us walking down the street, they would run. Mm. They would run the other way, and that was a life-changing situation for me. And I committed myself at that moment, and that was in 2006. Is that I was going to change the way the communities, the challenged communities in this city saw the police, because for so long I think it was just an expectation, not only from the community, also from the police, that was just the way it was. And I was coming in, and I just said, I can't I can't do this. I can't be here as the senior leader in this organization and walk through a community and have people run when they see this uniform. And that started me on a journey of a commitment that I was going to make changes. And now I can walk down those same streets and those kids will run to me, and the people in those neighborhoods will acknowledge me and shake my hand, and they will tell me about things that's going on in their family lives. Every Christmas, there's people over there that says, you know, I expect to, you know, to see you out here for our party. I expect to see you out here for our kids giveaway. So I am now a part of that community. And the way that happened was because I communicated with them. I committed to them that we're going to be here for you, because so often, and I think this stretches across government, is that we go into a community and we say we're here to help, we're here to create change, and within a few months or a few weeks, people start looking around and we're no longer there, either because the money ran out or because something else came up that's a higher priority. And I told those folks when I went there, I said, if you will work with me, we will not leave you. And we have not left them. And the biggest thing that I could give to them and they could give to me was consistency. Because so many of those children in that community were used to people telling them that they were going to do things, and then they didn't do them. Or either they showed up, you know, volunteers showed up for a few weeks, and then they left. And what I have found is that if that's what you're going to do, then don't start to begin with. Because those kids and people in challenged communities and people that are working to make their lives more enjoyable or more satisfying, they're tired of people telling them what they're going to do and then not doing it. So we have been very consistent. If there was something that we looked at that we couldn't do, that people wanted us to do, I was very honest with them. And I told them right from the beginning that you may not like what I'm going to tell you, but you will always count on one thing, is that I'm going to be honest with you. And that has created an opportunity for me to really create relationships that, again, on this night, that the community was stressed beyond what anybody had ever thought was going to happen. Those people came together. They supported me. I supported them. And we supported each other.
So and as I look at it, one of the things I think you did that made a huge difference, and it may be a little nuanced, but it's the difference between giving someone permission to come sit at your table and asking for their permission for you to come to theirs.
Right.
What kind of difference did that make, do you think?
Well, I think it made a huge difference, because what happens, you know, for so many people, they expect people in my position to play the role of, I'm coming to your meeting, I'm going to come to your function, or either I'm going to invite you to my meeting or my function, and we're going to sit around and we're going to talk about various things, and I'm going to nod my head a lot, and then after it's over with, you're going to walk out and nothing's going to change. And I think what we have been able to demonstrate through our ability to reach out and bring people into our organization is that they see immediately that we do things that they have suggested to us, like with the security cameras that we were putting up throughout the city. That policy was pretty much written by the communities that came in and talked with us. Just recently, we've started working, about 2 years ago, we started working with the LGBTQ community. And we brought them into the organization and said, look, we want you to come in and talk to us and train us and give us insights into how we can manage our relationships with you better. And they did, and they came in and they talked to the officers about their concerns, and they talked to the officers about things that were very important to the community. And now we have just created a policy on how to deal with the transgender community. And that input came from the liaison officers that we've now established with the LGBTQ community, so that we're not telling anybody how we're going to operate anymore. We're saying, let's come together as partners. And one of the things that I think has resonated with me over the years, and intuitively it's always been there, but I just recently heard somebody make a statement that really brought this home for me, is that partnerships will get you through the door. Relationships get you a seat at the table. And I think that's what we've been able to do over the years, is develop those relationships that not only gets us a seat at the community's table, it also gets the community a seat at our table. And when they bring issues to us, or when they come up with ideas and they see that those things are implemented, or that we're actually putting our foot forward to try to address those issues, then I think that just really resonates with the community. And one great example I'll give you is that during the Illumination Project listening sessions, a lot of the discussion was about, there's a lot of traffic stops that happen over equipment violations for tail lights and brake lights and tag lights and those kinds of things. And a lot of that is generated by people simply don't have the funds to either have it corrected, or it may be someone who doesn't even know it's a problem. So we started talking about, what could we do as an organization to, one, help eliminate even the opportunity for that police-citizen encounter to occur, and then at the same time reach out and show the community that, look, we want to do everything we can to make you safe and to make sure that when you're out in the roadways that everything is going well. So we started what we call a community vehicle inspection, that people can bring their cars to our fleet services, and we'll inspect the cars for them. We'll fix their headlights, their tail lights, their tag lights, their brake lights, whatever it is that's wrong with the car, and no charge. And what we've done there, again, reaching out to our community partners, is that we've got a parts dealership, we've got a tire dealership, because we found that when people come in, we're looking at their tires and they need to have them repaired. And then we've got a tent company that, a lot of the stops result around illegal tinting. So we now have those three partners that are working with us, and they're working with the community as well. They're providing vouchers for new tires, they're providing tent services. So far we've had 2 of these, and we've had about 50 cars from the community come in, and it's ranged from very young folks to elderly people who said, what, I haven't even driven my car in 6 months because the headlights have been out and I was afraid to. So the people that are engaged in that from the department, you can't, that's like a MasterCard moment there, that's priceless. For them to get that kind of feeling from the community, that appreciation, the guy from the parts store, he told me, he said, this is the greatest thing I've ever done. And he said, I'm proud to be a part of it. So, and the community sees that. They see that was a idea about how can we eliminate these equipment violations. And they never said, this is what we want you to do, or this is how we think you can do it. That was an idea that could help minimize a conflict between the police and the community. And now we're able to put that out there as, look, this is something that we were told. This is our way of trying to address it. It's concrete action.
Were you scared going into those community conversations?
Well, when we first wrote that, we wrote a little white paper that we gave to the mayor about what we wanted to do. And the last sentence in that was that, this is going to be very risky. This is very bold, and it's going to be a challenge, because we knew that we were going to hear some things that we didn't want to hear, and we also knew that we were going to have to say some things that other people didn't want to hear. Because one of the big differences between this particular process and what many others in the country have gone through is that anybody and everybody can come up with things that the police can do better or different. There's very few studies that have been done around law enforcement or police services that ask the police officers what is it, and the community, what they can do to make the relationships better. So out of the 86 strategies that actually came out of the final product, there was a number of them that are specific to what the community members can do, such as going through a orientation program that they learn about search and seizure, what it's like to do a traffic stop, walk down an alley in the middle of the night and not know what you're walking into. We actually put them through a virtual reality simulator, and they get to see what it's like to be a police officer for a few minutes. And that's the type of thing that we have really been pushing as well, to get the community to understand that police officers are human. We make mistakes just like everybody else, and we're not perfect, and we want to continue to get better, and we know that there's things that we need to do differently. And as long as we understand one another, and we understand that everyone involved is human, then we're going to have a much better future going forward. And that's really what we're starting to see, because this process, while it started out focusing just on the police, it's now expanded out into the full community. And we're having these small group facilitated discussions, and I can't emphasize that enough. I think that's one of the huge things that has been a success for us, is we don't do open mics. We don't do police setting up here behind the table and the audience sitting out talking at one another. We do very small groups. We have facilitators. We have structured questions, and we talk about things. And as a result of that, out of the sessions that we did initially, we had about 2,200 different ideas that came out of that. And that has continued now to where the community is coming together in these small group facilitated discussions and talking about things that are impacting the entire community. A great example is that we're trying to create shared experiences. So what we have done is we've taken, a good example is we have a Grace Episcopal church, and right next door to it is a Mount Zion AME church, predominantly white, predominantly black. So we have a listening session where we bring those two churches together, and they get to share experiences. We've also brought high school students together from very different high schools so that they, again, could share experiences and learn about one another. And so far this year, we've had about 900 individuals from the community come together at different times and discuss all types of things about race issues within our community. And what we have seen start to develop there is a much different understanding about one another and how we as a community can continue to move forward from this tragedy and not simply allow this to become an event that got a lot of attention and create a lot of momentum for a short period of time, and then everything reset back to where it was at. So it's really starting to evolve into a much bigger process than what we had originally thought of.
We had a speaker this afternoon that talked about hate, and one of the ways to combat it is through counter speech, so that when someone comes at you negatively, you don't come back at them negatively. And when she was talking about that, I was thinking about the victims' families in Charleston. And so when given an opportunity to face the person that murdered their loved ones, they said, "I forgive you." How much do you think that aided in the city's response and the fact that it didn't go left in Charleston like it did in so many other cities?
I think it was the foundation of everything that happened, because while there was a lot of relationships in place, and there was a lot of activity that came together to support the law enforcement component in terms of the investigation as well as the families. I think the fact that day, and I was in the courtroom that day, and I was very nervous about what was about to happen, because that was going to be the first time that the families had actually seen the shooter. And even though it was on video, that was going to be the first time, and there was a lot of anxiety in that room. And when that family member stepped up to the microphone and the first thing out of her mouth was, "I forgive you," that was not what I was expecting to hear. And it really, it set the tone for much of what occurred after that. Now, there was a lot of things that happened right at the night of the shooting, and I hope we get a chance to talk
Please, go
about
ahead.
that. But I can tell you without a doubt that the response of the families had a great deal to do with how the city responded. So 2 nights before the bond hearing, when the shooting actually happened, it was a very short period of time after the shooting that a group of clergy, elected officials, and senior community leaders that we had been working with over that 9-year period developing those relationships. And within an hour of the call and people just started coming to the scene, we pulled that group together. And Mayor Riley and myself spoke with them, and we gave them as much information as we could. And at that moment, we asked them to please help us to make sure that the community gave us the opportunity to address this situation and to trust us that we were going to do the right thing. And then very shortly after that, within about an hour, we had a family assistance center that we had established at one of the local hotels that was part of a plan that we had put in place a couple of years earlier, because we knew if there was ever a mass casualty situation that not only were we going to have to be focused on the investigation and the prosecution, but one of the biggest components of that success was going to be how we treated the victims and their families. So that Family Assistance Center brought together those mental health clinicians that we had been working with, brought together the chaplains that we had been working with, the victim advocates, all the people that we had created those relationships with over the years of bringing together and bonding with them and helping to determine how we could make our community healthier. They all came together that night in that Family Assistance Center, and they provided the support, the comfort, the grief helping that I think had more to do with the success of the overall components of the investigation as well as the whole outcome. Because again, and I heard somebody say this today, I can't remember which of the speakers it was, but he said, caring and kindness has a lot to do with how we create our communities. And I think that night, those individuals, whether it was the victims' families or the survivors' families or church members that were there was over 300 people in that room that night waiting to hear what was something they'd never wanted to hear before. And I believe that the fact that they saw the police responding in a way that was caring and kind and in a vein that we are hurting just like you are. We will never understand what you're going through, but we want you to know that we're here for you, and that's all we're focused on right here. We're not looking at the investigative piece. We're not worried about the prosecution. We're worried about you. And that continued all the way through the trial. And some of the relationships that were built between those officers and the victims' families and the survivors' families are ones that are remarkable and that you will never put a wedge between.
How did this change you?
Well, as I said earlier, this was the defining moment for my career. And you train, you put yourself through exercises and drills, and you hope that when that phone call comes that you're prepared, and that all the training and all the teaching that you've done to your staff and to your officers and all the culture that you've tried to instill in your organization, you hope all of that comes together. And I can say without a doubt that I was very, very proud of how we all responded. Mm-hmm. The community, the police department, all of our partners. And for me, I think what changed in my core is that it was a very personal attack. That was my city. Those were my people. And for that guy, and I don't ever use his name, for him to come in there into a church and kill 9 people while they were worshiping their God was the worst thing that I could ever think about happening in my city. And while it was horrible and it was unexplainable how I felt internally, I also knew that the community was depending on me to do what I needed to do. So when we had the first news conference, we said, this is a hate crime. We don't care if it's going to meet the elements of a federal hate crime or if it's going to be prosecuted as a hate crime. This is a hate crime. There's nothing else we can call it. And I knew at that moment, when we were having that first press conference, my mom looked at that press conference and she said, boy, you look like you were under a lot of stress. I said, you have no idea. But the one thing that when I look back and I look at those is that in most situations where you've seen around the country where tragedies have occurred, and you see the press conferences take place and you've got, police from everywhere, you've got elected officials from everywhere, you've got lots of government officials. And if you look at that press conference, the thing that it was really rewarding to me, and I think it says a lot about what we're talking about tonight, is that was really only 3 law enforcement people in that group and 1 elected official. And the rest of the people there, and there was a lot of people there, they were all community members. And that to me says this was a community event and we're going to work through this as a community event. And I often wonder about if this happened in the city of Charleston, how was it going to go? How were my partners going to react? Because so many times when things are going good and you have a press conference about a new initiative, you've got everybody standing around you and everybody's they're going to support you, and then sometimes you turn around and you're the only one there. So that was really rewarding to me. But I think what also really changed me is that a couple of days after the event, we had the first funeral. And the first funeral was for Reverend Clemente Pinckney. And he was a state senator as well as the pastor at the church. And the president, the vice president, the Secretary of State, Speaker of the House, the Attorney General, 75 members of Congress, and half of the South Carolina General Assembly attended that funeral along with about 7,000 other people. And what I really felt after that was that how am I going to make sure that every other family feels that their loved one is respected and has the honor, just like that funeral where all of those dignitaries and all those people showed up. So we did, obviously I couldn't have the president come back, but we did everything that we could to create the same scenario. I mean, we had police cars and people that stationed around the church, and everything that we could. And all of those things changed me a little bit. They all, I think back on that time, it was about 2 weeks of really nonstop time. And I think back on all of the things that happened, and one of the other really remarkable moments of that whole scenario that I think changed me, because again, all of these things that were happening were simply validating for me that those 3 questions that I asked myself. Is it worth it? Is it making a difference? Is it resonating with people? All those questions kept going through my mind, and all these things that were happening kept telling me that absolutely the answer is yes. Absolutely the answer is yes. And, you know, some of them were small, some of them were big. And I'll never forget the day that a number of organizations were coming into the city, and their whole goal was to disrupt. And I got on the telephone and I called about a dozen people that were my partners. And this was the defining moment that here we're going to find out how much of a partner we really are. And when I called them, I said, look, these folks are in town. All they're trying to do is create hate. You know, this is our home. We don't want anybody coming in here and burning down our home or destroying our home. And for years now, every time I see you, you say, Chief, if there's ever anything I can do for you, just give me a call. So I said, I'm giving you that call, and I need you to get out there and tell these folks that we don't need you here. And they did that. They got out and they said, we don't want you here. We don't need you here. Go home. And so the police never had to deal with those folks, which in and of itself was a huge blessing to the city, to the police, to the overall situation. And that created an environment that continued all the way through the trial. I know I was talking with Bruce this morning. He reminded me that when the trial started, that one of the headlines is, you know, instigators go home, we've got this. That was the message from the community. So all of those things changed me in terms of, one, how could somebody go through such a horrible incident and forgive that person so quickly? Secondly, is that, you know, no matter what anybody ever tells me, that if you work hard at creating relationships with people and doing the right thing and respecting other people like you would want to be respected and treat people fairly, that when it comes time to really, when the rubber meets the road, that all of that is going to pay off for you. And then just from a personal perspective, I mean, I'm a part of Charleston. You know, I'm leaving Charleston or the police department, but this has created in my soul that I can look back and say, we were strong that day. Charleston was strong that day. And I hope that if I am ever in a situation like that, where I have a loved one that is either harmed or murdered, that I will have the grace to do the same thing. Because when I see these families and when I see the victims, I mean, I've established a relationship with them that will never go away. When I see Felicia Sanders and when I see Polly Shepard, who were the two people that lived through that, and they've got the strength to go on, you know, that tells me that I best not be complaining about much, because they're strong people, they're honorable people, and they're amazing people.
As I watched them, you know, do that, to forgive, I couldn't help but think about myself. I'd like to think that I have that capacity. I'd like to think my faith is that strong. I'm just not sure. I just don't know. I don't know if I could stand there and do that. I'd like to think I could, but I don't know that for sure.
Well, you know, one of the polarities that we have talked about quite a bit in terms of... Let
me stop you and ask him. So let's assume for a minute that Bruce Byington is not one of my dear friends and colleagues.
Okay.
And let's assume that I don't know what this whole polarity thing is.
Right.
Explain it to me, and then what were some of the polarities you all exposed and unearthed in Charleston? Sure.
Well, you know, again, going back to the problem solver issue, is that many people think that everything that you face is a problem to be solved. And in reality, there's a lot of things that are not problems to be solved. They're simply, there's tension that go on between two values or two polarities that need to be managed. And in our case, one of the things that we talked about a lot with the organization was this polarity of justice and mercy. How do you hold people accountable for the crimes that they commit or the actions that they take, and then also be willing to show mercy, in terms of how you respond to them, or what are the ramifications of the actions that they take, or public safety and individual rights. We've got to have we want to have a city and a community that's safe, and we also want to make sure that the people that are living in that community, their rights are protected and they're guaranteed, and that we're not over focusing on either one of those two things. And and one of the really strong polarities that we have worked on for years now is enforcement and community support. Is that the community wants me as the police chief to make sure that we're enforcing laws that are appropriate and that are required for us to have a safe city. And if I do that in a way that feels like an occupying force, or feels like that I'm being overly aggressive in terms of enforcement, then I'm going to lose that community support, which I really need to make sure that the community is as safe as it can be. So as we have gone through that process and looked at those opportunities, the guiding principle behind those polarities is that you have a greater purpose that everybody can agree upon. We might not always agree on the two values, which is more important. What I can always agree on, though, is that if I want a safe and enjoyable community, everybody in the room can agree on that. Mm-hmm. And then we start talking about the enforcement and the community support. How do we get the best of enforcement, and how do we get the best of community support, and stay away from the things that are negative about both of those values? So that's what we have been working on as an organization and also as a community. Mm-hmm. And that has been a huge benefit for us, not only in the early stages, but also through this project. Because what we did at the very beginning of this, we had everybody that comes to our listening sessions, the first thing we ask them, because we have the Polarity map, and we say, how many people in the room are really like public safety? Everybody in the room raises their hand. And then you say, okay, who in the room is really strongly supportive of individual rights? And everybody in the room raise your hand. So it's like, okay, so we all agree on that. And we all agree that we want a safe and enjoyable community. So now let's just sit down and talk about how we get the best of both of those values and stay away from the areas that take us into a negative component. So that has been a thought process that has really changed the way we think within our organization. We've used it as individual coaching for senior staff and supervisors so that they, again, can change the way they think about things. And it's just been very positive in terms of how we have managed our relationships, both internally and externally, as we've gone forward.
And one of the key words in the polarity thinking is and.
That is correct.
And not versus. It's not
an
public
either or.
Safety versus
That's
community.
Right.
It's public safety and
right.
individual rights.
You got to have both.
So, did you uncover biases that you had, that you didn't realize you had in this process?
Well, one of the things that we did as we have been evolving, going back to that 2014, really changed the way things were happening in law enforcement. One of the things that we started to do is to train all of our officers on implicit bias, because obviously it's very, if you see explicit bias, it's very easy to deal with that. And when you have implicit bias, and what I think happens is that you recognize that everybody has some biases. Everybody has a stereotype that they have within themselves that they might not even know is there. So we started to train the officers in this implicit bias and give them some tools to really help them to manage that when they're out doing their job. And what I think what I found, and it's not really it's not really something that a bias that happened in this particular scenario. I found a bias in myself early on that I had, in some cases, I needed to be careful that I wasn't over-focusing on any certain community, because I found myself relating to the most challenged communities more so than I did the affluent communities within Charleston. I could relate with the individuals that were in the challenged communities, and what I found was that in many cases, those communities were not receiving what I felt like was the appropriate attention. And in some cases, it became very challenging for me when I was implementing processes that challenged the status quo. And some of those things was based on with fundamental fairness. Is that when I got to Charleston, I saw people doing things at football games and during special events that during the week they would be calling about, saying, well, why are you not enforcing alcohol rules in this particular neighborhood with people drinking on the corner out of 40-ounce cans and paper bags, but it's okay for me to walk down the street in a wine walk or walk down the street at a football game drinking whatever I want. And I said, well, if you want me to enforce the law Monday through Friday with the 40-ounce can in the bag, I'm going to enforce the law on Saturday going to the football game or at the wine walk on King Street. And that was, a couple things happened there. I found out whether my mayor was going to support me or not early on. And I made a lot of people mad in Charleston. And I think over time that people recognized the fact that that was one of the characteristics in me that they really liked, is that I was going to be fair, no matter who you were or where you lived or what you did, that you always could count on the fact that I was going to treat everybody the same.
Great. I told you earlier that a few years ago I actually had the opportunity at a philanthropic event held in Charleston to interview Mayor Riley about the influence of philanthropy in the community. And he's a great supporter of philanthropy and is very active. And at that time, he was in his 37th year as mayor. And he just retired at the end of 2015 after 40 years as mayor. How did that help? How did him having been there that long, and what I came away with after having just spent a little time with him was he was a mayor for all the people. How did that contribute to the success you had?
Well, it contributed to the success of the community. You can't put a number on it, or you can't really put a specific quote in there in terms of how much Mayor Riley's engagement and his influence on Charleston had on this and many other events that occurred. He was a mayor for all people. He brought everybody to the table. Everybody had a seat at his table, and he heard from everybody. He listened to people, and he had a wonderful way about him in terms of calming the situation. And I was very fortunate to work for him for about 8 years, and I can say that he and I had a relationship that was much deeper than a mayor and a police chief. He was my friend. He was my mentor. He trusted me. I trusted him. I knew that if things got difficult, that if I was wrong, he was going to say I was wrong. And if I was right, he was going to stand behind me. And that's about all you can ask for when you're dealing with a boss. And through that time, he and I became very, we understood our roles. I knew he was anything political or anything that dealt with the administration of the organization as a whole. He dealt with that, and he left me alone to do my operational business. And then when this event happened, I think that again, all of those years of relationships, all of those years of friendship, all those years of talking about things and trusting one another, we came together, and he knew what his role was. His role was to calm the community and let the community know that it was going to be okay. My role was to run the police operation and the investigation and deal with the families, and together we really complemented each other, I think, to a point that I almost knew what he was going to do before he did it, and he knew what I was going to do before I did it. And it was really one of those once-in-a-lifetime partnerships that doesn't come along very often.
So let's acknowledge now that there's some other people in here with us. And I'm going to let you, address these folks and tell them if they want to create a community that sees itself as one community and not 4 or 5 or 6, what advice would you give them? How can they make happen in their communities, and again, which all leads to improving the health of a community? How can they make their communities similar? And then we'll take a few questions from the audience. I think we'll have time.
Well, one of the things that I would say that I see regularly that I have been able to overcome is that there's so often that people are looking for the magic answer, or they're waiting for either the right grant to come in, or they're waiting for a budget to come in that's going to fund all of these things that you want to do. And what I would say to you is that that's probably never going to happen. And a great example of that is a couple years ago when we started this family violence unit, which I think has the potential to be so wonderful for not only the Charleston community, but for others. Our mental health partner and the medical community, we put this great grant in, and we were hoping we were going to get it and it was going to allow us to do a lot of things. Well, we didn't get it. We got the big no. Great application, but no thank you. So what we did is we pulled those people together that were willing to do that, and we said, you know what, this is important enough that we're going to do it regardless. We're going to put the effort into this and the resources here to start this project. And we did that. And it had so much success over the first year. Again, like I was saying earlier, it's been in place now 3 years, and we've touched 1,500 kids that we would never have seen before. They would have never gotten any intervention. And now what's happened is all of the police agencies around us are saying, the clinician that we have working with us, her name is Denise, and she's a wonderful person, and they all say now, we want a Denise. And so what has happened is that the state now, the state mental health department has now provided a grant that is funding 5 more Denises in the regions or in the police departments around us. And in the state office in Columbia, they now have a map. And they're starting to put these little red pins in every police agency around the state that has a Denise and that has a family violence unit that are looking out for things that are happening that we have to communicate and address now. So what I would say to you is try to move beyond that. Everything's about budgets, and everything is about extra resources, and everything is about I've got to be the one that's in charge, because I can tell you that of all the things that we're doing in the police department and all the partnerships that we're putting together, what we are doing is putting the vision out there, and then when our partners come together, we're basically, we want to be the support mechanism. We don't want to be the leaders. And what that has allowed us to do is that it does not appear that we're competing with anybody. We're not competing with their funds. We're not competing with their roles. And we're able to say to everybody at the end of the day that this is about making our community better. It's not about sustaining a particular program. It's not about sustaining a particular position. It's about making our community better. And what I have found is that when you go into this process with that in mind, and you get the buy-in of the people, that all the other things are going to work themselves out. And right now, with that new initiative we were talking about going in, and we're going to be talking about health and wellness and screening for hypertension and diabetes and all those things that we know are problems in that community. We've got the Medical University of South Carolina, Roper, which is the two biggest hospitals in our area. We've got Access Health, which is the connector of all the different agencies. We've got Federal Clinic, which is the provider within the community. And we're talking with MUSC about maybe taking our nursing program and coming into that clinic in the afternoon and evening hours. So not only are we helping the clinic, but we're also helping those nursing students to get connected with the community. So all of those things that are happening there have resulted from pulling some people together and saying, look, we've got an issue, and if we don't address it, who will? If not us, who? And that, to me, is what all of us in our capacities have to bring to the table and break out of the silos and start working cross-functionally, because if we don't, we're going to continue down this road of we're going to compete with one another, we're going to duplicate efforts, and we're not going to impact where we have the opportunities. And 10 years from now, we're going to continue to talk about how these neighborhoods that are challenged are going through the same type of issues, and it's just going to be another generation and another generation. And we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to do that? And from our perspective and from my perspective, that's not an option. Failure is not an option, and that's how we push forward, and that's how I would encourage all of you in your particular roles to do the same thing in your communities.
Do you have time for any questions? So we're out of time. But Chief Mullen has said he would hang around and talk with folks one-on-one if you'd like. So let's please, again, thank him. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.